She walked into the boardroom with power in her stride, the kind that made everyone else fall silent. But when her eyes landed on the man in worn jeans and grease-stained boots, her voice turned sharp, mocking. In front of her entire team, she laughed at him, daring him with a bet no one expected her to make. "Fix this engine, and I'll marry you." The room erupted in cruel smirks, certain he would fail. But what they didn't know was that this moment, meant to humiliate him, would reveal far more about her than about him. She thought it was a joke, but the lesson that followed would change everything. For Deshaun Tillman, life was simple but steady. He grew up in Kansas City, where the heartbeat of his world was a small family garage. The floors were cracked, the waiting chairs creaked, and the paint on the sign had long since faded. But inside, he found purpose. By the time he was 16, Deshaun could rebuild an engine block from scratch. Customers trusted him not just because he fixed what others couldn't, but because he listened. To him, every sound a machine made was a language, and he had learned to hear it. He wasn't chasing fame or money or prestige. He just wanted to keep people moving, neighbors and strangers alike. Yet that quiet skill, the same patience that made him invaluable in his community, was about to pull him into a world he never expected. A world of glass towers, powerful executives, and silent judgments the moment he walked through the door. Because while Deshaun's hands carried the marks of honest work, the people waiting for him at Helix Dynamics saw only his skin, his boots, and the grease under his nails. And in that polished boardroom, one cruel remark would turn his everyday life into a stage for humiliation, or for something far greater. He thought he was just there to solve a problem, but what he was really walking into was a test of dignity, pride, and resilience. The boardroom at Helix Dynamics wasn't built for people like Deshaun Tillman. Polished floors reflected the shine of expensive shoes, glass walls framed the skyline of Dallas, and every chair at the mahogany table was occupied by someone with a degree from a school he had only heard about on TV. Deshaun walked in wearing steel-toe boots that tracked faint dust across the floor, a plain shirt tucked into jeans that had seen too many late nights at the garage. He carried only a battered toolbox. The moment he entered, eyes locked on him, not with curiosity but with judgment. A few smirked. One engineer whispered just loud enough for his colleagues to hear, "This is the expert?" Laughter rippled, quick and cutting, before dying down when Vanessa Aldridge herself leaned back in her chair. Vanessa was known for her sharp tongue and her sharper instincts. She had built a reputation for being untouchable, the kind of leader who never bowed, never softened. And now, with her engineers watching, she turned her gaze on Deshaun. Her words came out smooth, edged with cruelty. "Fix this engine, and I'll marry you." The laughter this time was louder, not because anyone believed the offer, but because they were certain it was impossible. Here was a black mechanic from Kansas City standing in the middle of one of the nation's fastest-growing tech companies, asked to succeed where the brightest minds had already failed. To them, the bet was theater, an invitation to watch him stumble. Deshaun said nothing at first. He just set his toolbox down, opened it, and began pulling out the tools of his trade. Wrenches worn from years of use, a voltmeter that still bore scratches from his grandfather's shop. The contrast was almost absurd, his rough everyday instruments against a machine that represented hundreds of millions in research. A senior engineer leaned forward, glasses sliding down his nose. "He doesn't even know the schematics," he muttered. Another added, "This is going to be embarrassing." Their words weren't meant for Deshaun, but they were loud enough. He ignored them. Instead, he crouched beside the prototype, running his fingers lightly over the exposed wiring. To him, it wasn't just a collection of parts, it was a voice no one else had bothered to hear. That silence unsettled the room. They expected him to fumble, to ask questions, to reveal ignorance. Instead, he worked with the quiet confidence of someone who knew machines better than most people knew themselves. But it wasn't just the machine he was up against. It was perception. Every glance, every chuckle, every smirk carried the same message. You don't belong here. Vanessa smirked, resting her chin on her hand. Respect, is that it? That's your secret? She asked after he mentioned listening instead of rushing. I've got PhDs who couldn't fix this, but you're telling me all it takes is respect? Deshawn tightened a wire and looked up calmly. Machines don't care about resumes. They care about respect. The boardroom fell into an uneasy quiet. For the first time, a few younger engineers leaned forward, intrigued. But Vanessa's pride wasn't so easily shaken. Her challenge had been a performance, and now her ego demanded a front-row seat to his downfall. The prototype sat like a puzzle in pieces. Burn marks scarred the panel from failed attempts. Wires dangled loosely, evidence of weeks of frustration from the brightest minds in the field. To the engineers, it was proof of impossibility. To Deshawn, it was an invitation. Still, the weight of the room pressed down. Every turn of his wrench was under a microscope, every breath measured against the expectation that he would fail. And in the silence that stretched on, the stakes became clear. If he succeeded, it would be more than fixing an engine. It would be defying the very narrative written about him before he had walked through the door. The tension grew sharper with every movement. Some leaned back, arms crossed, waiting for the inevitable. Others whispered predictions about how quickly it would collapse. Vanessa's smirk deepened, but in the corner of her eye, a flicker of curiosity betrayed her. Because deep down, even she knew. If he pulled this off, it wouldn't just be her engine that changed. It would be her entire story. He thought the hardest part was getting into the room. But the real test, the one that would push him to the edge, was only just beginning. Deshawn's hands moved with steady precision, but the room around him vibrated with doubt. Every glance carried the weight of a verdict already decided, that he didn't belong here, that failure was inevitable. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her smirk daring him to try. The air felt electric, heavy with anticipation of a public humiliation. He traced a wire harness, brow furrowing. Something wasn't connecting. The simulations had been run 100 times, but the basics had been ignored. He unclipped the panel, tightened the bracket, and rerouted a cable. The senior engineer scoffed loudly, shaking his head. He doesn't even know what he's looking at. But then, a spark. Small, faint, but enough to shift the silence. Deshawn adjusted again, tightening his grip on the wrench, his movements methodical. The machine responded, a low hum starting beneath the metal casing. The smirks faltered. Chairs squeaked as people leaned forward. Vanessa's smirk froze into something else, something closer to disbelief. Her mocking bet echoed in the air. Fix this engine, and I'll marry you. She had expected a spectacle of failure, a reinforcement of hierarchy, but the hum was growing louder, steadier, alive. Then, with a sharp flick of the switch, the engine roared. Not a sputter, not a stall. An unbroken surge of power. The room jolted. Engineers who had spent sleepless nights chasing this moment now stared, slack-jawed, at the mechanic they had mocked. But Deshawn wasn't celebrating. He stood quietly, tools in hand, the roar of the machine filling the boardroom like a defiant anthem. For him, this wasn't about proving Vanessa wrong. It was about proving that he had always been right, that skill, respect, and patience could outshine arrogance and prejudice. Yet the moment carried more than victory. It carried tension, because as the engine ran flawlessly, no one in that room could ignore the truth anymore. The black mechanic they had dismissed, ridiculed, and underestimated had done in minutes what they couldn't do in months. And for Vanessa, every second of that engine's hum chipped away at the story she had built of superiority. Her eyes darted across the room, catching the stunned stares of her own engineers. For the first time in years, her authority wavered. Pride battled disbelief, and behind her cool expression, a question pressed hard. Had she just handed him the stage that would undo her? The roar of the engine wasn't just mechanical, it was symbolic. It was the sound of every doubt silenced, every smirk erased, every whispered insult returned with undeniable truth. In that moment, Vanessa realized she had mocked the wrong man. And Deshawn realized something too, that sometimes the very stage built for your downfall becomes the platform for your triumph. The question wasn't whether he had fixed the engine. The question now was what came next, because after a victory this undeniable, no one could pretend things would go back to the way they were. The engine's roar eventually quieted, but the silence that followed carried more weight than sound ever could. Deshawn packed his tools slowly, not with arrogance, but with the calm dignity of a man who had nothing left to prove. Across the table, the engineers avoided his gaze, shame flickering where arrogance once sat. Vanessa, still in her chair, no longer smirked. For the first time, she was forced to confront a truth she couldn't dismiss. The man she mocked had exposed more than a flaw in her prototype. He had exposed a flaw in her perspective. For Deshawn, it wasn't about victory or marriage proposals tossed out as jokes. It was about respect, about being seen for the worth he carried long before stepping into that boardroom. In a single moment, he had turned ridicule into revelation. But stories like his don't always end this way. Too often talent is overlooked, voices are dismissed, and dignity is stripped away because of the color of one's skin or the dirt on one's boots. Deshawn's triumph was rare, not because he lacked the ability, but because so many never get the chance to stand at the table in the first place. That's the deeper weight of this story. It's not just about an engine, a company, or a careless remark. It's about what happens when prejudice blinds us to brilliance. About the countless opportunities lost, the countless lives stifled, when judgment takes the place of respect. The question isn't whether Deshawn proved himself. He always had. The question is, how many more Deshawns will be mocked, doubted, or dismissed before we finally learn to listen, to see, and to value people for who they are, not for the labels we place on them?